The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as 8-year-old Princess Charlotte walked quietly along the stone pathway. Her small hands clutched a worn teddy bear, its fur matted from countless nights of comfort. The palace grounds were unusually quiet for a Tuesday morning, with most of the staff attending to their duties inside the grand building. Charlotte had always been different from other children her age. While her brothers, Prince George and Prince Louis, seemed to naturally embrace their royal roles, Charlotte often felt like an outsider looking in. She understood the weight of her title, the expectations that came with being fourth in line to the throne, but sometimes the burden felt too heavy for her young shoulders. The previous evening had been particularly difficult. Her parents, Prince William and Catherine, had hosted a formal dinner for visiting diplomats. Charlotte had been expected to make a brief appearance dressed in her finest clothes, to greet the guests with perfect manners and a rehearsed smile. She had performed her role flawlessly as always, but afterward, she had retreated to her room feeling more isolated than ever. As she wandered through the garden, Charlotte noticed movement near the security perimeter. A tall figure in the distinctive red uniform and black bearskin hat of the Queen's Guard stood at attention. She had seen these guards countless times throughout her life, but had never really thought about the people beneath the uniforms. They were like living statues to her, present but not really there. The guard in question was Sergeant James Morrison, a 28-year-old man from Yorkshire who had served in the British Army for nearly a decade. He had been assigned to royal protection duty 6 months earlier, and while he took his responsibilities seriously, he had never expected to form any personal connection with the family he was sworn to protect. James had noticed the young princess during his shifts before. Unlike her siblings, who seemed comfortable with the constant presence of security, Charlotte appeared to deliberately avoid the guards. She would take different routes through the palace grounds, always keeping her distance, always maintaining the invisible barrier that separated royalty from those who served them. On this particular morning, however, something was different. James could see that the princess looked troubled. Her usual confident posture was replaced by slumped shoulders, and she moved with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying an invisible weight. His military training had taught him to observe and assess situations quickly, and every instinct told him that this child was struggling with something beyond her years. Charlotte stopped near a large oak tree, about 20 feet from where James stood guard. She sat down on a small wooden bench that had been placed there years earlier, setting her teddy bear beside her. For several minutes, she simply stared at the ground, occasionally glancing up at the guard who remained motionless at his post. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the gentle rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Charlotte found herself studying the guard's face, what little she could see beneath the shadow of his enormous hat. She had always wondered what these men thought about as they stood so perfectly still for hours at a time. James, meanwhile, was fighting an internal battle. His training dictated that he maintain his position and avoid any unnecessary interaction with members of the royal family. Protocol was clear. Guards were to be invisible protectors, present but not intrusive. Any deviation from this rule could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal from his position. Yet something about the princess's demeanor troubled him deeply. She looked so small and alone sitting on that bench, despite being surrounded by the luxury and protection that her position afforded. He had younger siblings back home in Yorkshire, and he recognized the signs of a child who needed comfort but didn't know how to ask for it. Charlotte's thoughts drifted to her classmates at school. She attended Thomas's Battersea, where she was known simply as Charlotte Cambridge to her peers. While her parents had tried to give her as normal an upbringing as possible, the reality of her royal status always created an invisible wall between her and the other children. They were kind to her, but she could sense their awareness of who she was, the careful way they spoke around her, the way their parents coached them on proper behavior when she was present. The loneliness had been building for weeks. Her recent birthday party had been a perfect example. The event had been meticulously planned by the palace staff, with carefully selected guests and activities designed to be both fun and appropriate for a royal celebration. But Charlotte had spent most of the party feeling like she was performing rather than celebrating, smiling and thanking people while desperately wishing she could just be a normal child having a normal birthday. As she sat on the bench, Charlotte found herself making a decision that would change everything. She looked up at the guard, really looked at him, and for the first time in her young life, she decided to reach out to someone who existed in her world but outside her immediate circle of family and carefully vetted companions. Slowly, Charlotte raised her small hand and gave a tentative wave in James's direction. It was a simple gesture, the kind that children make instinctively when seeking connection with another human being. But in the context of royal protocol, it was revolutionary. James saw the wave and felt his heart skip a beat. This was uncharted territory. He had been trained to maintain professional distance to avoid any behavior that could be interpreted as familiarity or impropriety. But looking at this lonely child, he found that his human instincts were stronger than his military conditioning. After a moment's hesitation, James made a choice that would alter the course of both their lives. Breaking protocol for the first time in his military career, he returned Charlotte's wave with a small, barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement. The effect on Charlotte was immediate and profound. Her face lit up with the first genuine smile she had worn in weeks. That simple acknowledgement, that brief moment of human connection, filled a void she hadn't even realized existed. For the first time in her young life, someone in her world had seen her not as Princess Charlotte, but simply as Charlotte, a child who needed to know that she wasn't invisible. This small exchange, lasting no more than a few seconds, marked the beginning of an extraordinary friendship that would test the boundaries of royal protocol and challenge everything both of them had been taught about the proper order of their very different worlds. Neither Charlotte nor James could have imagined that this single, secret gesture would set in motion events that would forever change their understanding of duty, friendship, and what it truly means to protect someone you care about. The days following their first exchange brought subtle changes to both Charlotte's and James's routines. Charlotte began timing her garden walks to coincide with James's shifts, though she was careful to make these encounters appear accidental. She had learned early in life that royal children were always being watched, and any deviation from expected behavior would be noted and reported. James found himself looking forward to these brief moments of connection. During his off-duty hours, he couldn't stop thinking about the lonely princess who had reached out to him with such a simple gesture. He had grown up in a working-class family where affection and acknowledgement were freely given, and it troubled him to see a child so starved for basic human warmth. Their second encounter happened 3 days later. Charlotte was sitting in the same spot, this time with a book in her lap, though she wasn't really reading. She kept glancing up at James, who stood at his usual post near the garden entrance. When their eyes met, she offered another small wave, and this time James responded with a subtle smile that barely moved his lips, but reached his eyes. Over the following weeks, their silent communication developed into an elaborate system of gestures. Charlotte would touch her nose if she was feeling particularly sad about something. James would adjust his stance slightly to let her know he had noticed. If she was excited about something, a good grade at school or a successful piano lesson, she would bounce slightly on her bench. James would respond by standing a little taller, showing her that he shared in her happiness. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday morning in late September. Charlotte arrived at the garden earlier than usual, clearly upset about something. She had argued with her brother George that morning about a toy, and their nanny had scolded both of them for making noise during an important phone call their mother was having with palace officials. The incident had left Charlotte feeling guilty and frustrated, emotions that seemed too big for her small frame to contain. James immediately noticed her distress. Instead of sitting on her usual bench, Charlotte was pacing back and forth under the covered walkway, her teddy bear clutched tightly against her chest. Every few seconds, she would look in his direction, with an expression that clearly showed she was struggling with something she didn't know how to handle. After several minutes of watching her pace, James made another decision that went against his training. He slowly moved from his assigned position to a spot that was closer to Charlotte, but still within the acceptable boundaries of his patrol area. It was a small adjustment, but it brought him near enough that they could communicate without anyone else noticing. Charlotte immediately understood what he had done. She stopped pacing and looked directly at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the distance that separated them. Not just the physical space, but the vast social divide that dictated they should never truly interact. Then Charlotte did something that surprised even herself. She held up her teddy bear and pointed to a small tear in its fabric near the left ear. It was a tiny gesture, but it carried enormous meaning. She was showing him something that mattered to her, sharing a small piece of her private world with someone she was beginning to trust. James understood immediately. The bear was damaged, just like Charlotte felt damaged by the morning's events. He wanted desperately to comfort her, to tell her that childhood arguments were normal and that she shouldn't carry such guilt over something so small. But the constraints of his position meant he had to find other ways to communicate his support. Slowly, James reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was a picture of his own childhood teddy bear, which his mother had sent him when he first joined the army. He held it up just long enough for Charlotte to see, then carefully tucked it back into his pocket. The effect on Charlotte was magical. Her face transformed from sadness to wonder as she realized that this strong, serious guard had also once been a child who needed comfort from a stuffed animal. The connection she felt in that moment was deeper than anything she had experienced with her carefully supervised playdates or formal royal engagements. From that day forward, their relationship deepened beyond simple gestures. Charlotte began, bringing small items to show James during their encounters: a drawing she had made in art class, a flower she had picked during a walk, a book she particularly enjoyed. James, in turn, would occasionally show her small mementos from his own life: a photo of his family, a medal he had earned during his military service, a letter from his younger sister. Their secret friendship created a sanctuary for Charlotte within the rigid structure of her royal life. For 30 minutes each day, she could be simply herself with someone who saw her as a person rather than a title. James provided something that even her loving parents couldn't give her: a relationship free from the expectations and responsibilities that came with being a member of the royal family. However, their growing closeness did not go entirely unnoticed. Other palace staff began to comment quietly among themselves about the princess's regular visits to the garden. The head of security, Colonel Thompson, noticed that Charlotte seemed happier and more confident in recent weeks. Though he couldn't identify the cause of the change, Charlotte's governess, Miss Williams, observed that the young princess had become more engaged in her lessons and seemed less withdrawn during public appearances. Even Prince William and Catherine noticed their daughter's improved mood, attributing it to her natural development and growing maturity. The irony was that while the adults around Charlotte celebrated her newfound confidence and happiness, none of them suspected that the source of this positive change was a simple friendship with someone they considered to be merely part of the security apparatus. James, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. His military career had always been focused on duty and protocol, but his connection with Charlotte was teaching him about the importance of compassion and human understanding. He began to see his role not just as a protector of royal property and persons, but as a guardian of a child's emotional well-being. Their friendship existed in a delicate balance, requiring both of them to be constantly aware of their surroundings and careful not to attract unwanted attention. They developed an intuitive understanding of when it was safe to communicate and when they needed to maintain complete professional distance. This careful dance continued for several months, with both Charlotte and James treasuring their daily moments of connection, while remaining acutely aware that their friendship existed outside the boundaries of what was considered appropriate. Neither of them could have predicted that this secret bond they had created would soon be tested in ways that would force them both to choose between following the rules and following their hearts. The first real test of their friendship came on a cold November morning when Charlotte arrived at the garden in obvious distress. She had overheard a conversation between her parents and their private secretary about increased security measures following a credible threat against the royal family. While the adults had been careful not to frighten the children, Charlotte had understood enough to realize that someone, somewhere, wanted to hurt her family. That morning, Charlotte couldn't sit still on her usual bench. She kept looking around nervously, jumping at every sound from the nearby streets. The carefree child who had waved at James just months earlier was now hyper-aware of every shadow, every movement beyond the palace walls. James immediately recognized the signs of fear in her behavior. His military experience had taught him to identify when someone was operating under stress, and everything about Charlotte's demeanor screamed anxiety. She kept clutching her teddy bear and looking toward the palace as if considering running back inside where she would feel safer. For the first time since their friendship began, James faced a genuine dilemma. His professional duty required him to maintain his post and avoid any interaction that might compromise security protocols. However, his human instinct told him that Charlotte needed reassurance, and he was possibly the only person in her immediate vicinity who could provide it. The decision was made for him when Charlotte suddenly stood up from her bench and began walking directly toward him. This had never happened before. Their entire relationship had been built on careful distance and subtle communication, but fear had overridden Charlotte's usual caution, and she was seeking comfort from the one person in her world who felt genuinely safe. James watched her approach with a mixture of concern and alarm. If anyone saw this interaction, it could mean the end of his career and potentially create a security incident. Yet as Charlotte drew closer, he could see tears in her eyes and the way her small hand shook as she held her teddy bear. When she stopped just a few feet away from him, Charlotte whispered her first actual words to James. "Are you going to keep me safe?" The question hit James like a physical blow. Here was this brave little girl, carrying burdens that no 8-year-old should have to bear, asking him for the one thing he was actually trained to provide. Yet the way she asked it, not as a princess demanding protection from a subordinate, but as a frightened child seeking comfort from a friend, made it clear that she wasn't just talking about physical safety. James broke protocol completely. He knelt down to Charlotte's eye level, making himself smaller and less intimidating, and spoke his first words to her in return. "Yes, Your Highness. I promise you that I will always keep you safe." The formality of his address was instinctive, but his tone was gentle and reassuring. Charlotte seemed to understand that he was struggling between his official duties and his personal feelings, just as she struggled between being a princess and being a normal child. "Can you call me just Charlotte?" she asked quietly. "When it's just us, I mean. I like being just Charlotte sometimes." This simple request represented everything that was both beautiful and dangerous about their friendship. Charlotte was asking James to see her as a person rather than a title, to treat her with the casual affection she craved but rarely received. For James, it meant abandoning the professional distance he had been trained to maintain. "Of course, Charlotte," he said, and the sound of her name without a royal title felt both natural and revolutionary. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the garden path. James immediately stood and returned to his formal position, while Charlotte quickly walked back toward her bench, both of them hoping that their brief interaction had gone unnoticed. The approaching figure was Miss Williams, Charlotte's governess, who had been sent to collect the princess for her morning lessons. She noticed nothing unusual about the scene, a guard at his post and Charlotte sitting quietly with her teddy bear, but something about the atmosphere felt different to her trained eye. "Come along." "Your Highness," Miss Williams called. "It's time for your French lesson." Charlotte obediently gathered her things and began walking toward the palace, but as she passed James, she whispered, "Thank you," so quietly that only he could hear. That afternoon, James found himself thinking about their conversation while off-duty in his quarters. Charlotte's question about safety had forced him to examine his own role in a new light. He had always understood his job in terms of preventing physical threats and maintaining perimeter security. But Charlotte's needs went beyond protection from external dangers. She needed someone to help her feel emotionally secure in a world where she was constantly watched, judged, and held to impossible standards. The next morning brought validation of James's instincts. Charlotte appeared in the garden looking noticeably more relaxed than she had the previous day. She had clearly thought about their conversation and found comfort in his promise to keep her safe. She gave him their usual wave, but this time it carried additional meaning. It was a greeting between friends who had shared something real. Over the following weeks, their relationship evolved to include brief, whispered conversations whenever circumstances allowed. These exchanges were always carefully timed and positioned to avoid detection, but they provided both Charlotte and James with something they hadn't realized they were missing. Charlotte began sharing more details about her daily life, her struggles with piano lessons, her excitement about upcoming family trips, her concerns about living up to expectations. James, in turn, told her stories about his childhood in Yorkshire, his siblings, and the things he had learned during his military service that had nothing to do with protection or protocol. These conversations revealed the fundamental loneliness that existed in both their lives. Charlotte was surrounded by people whose primary relationship with her was defined by her royal status. James was part of an organization where personal feelings were considered irrelevant to professional performance. Their friendship provided both of them with a space where they could be authentic without judgment. However, the very thing that made their relationship special also made it dangerous. Palace life operated on strict hierarchies and clearly defined roles. The friendship between a royal child and a guard challenged these structures in ways that could have serious consequences for both of them. James began to notice increased scrutiny from his superior officers. Colonel Thompson had started making unexpected appearances during James's shifts, observing his performance with unusual attention. While James had received no direct criticism, he sensed that his behavior was being evaluated more closely than before. Charlotte, meanwhile, was becoming bolder in her interactions with James, sometimes forgetting the need for caution in her eagerness to share something with her friend. She had started asking her governess questions about the guards, where they came from, how long they served, whether they had families, questions that seemed innocent but could potentially draw unwanted attention to her interest in palace security, personnel. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would force both Charlotte and James to choose between the safety of their secret friendship and the loyalty they owed to the institutions that governed their lives. Neither of them fully understood the forces that were beginning to align against them, but both sensed that their precious moments of connection were becoming increasingly fragile. The crisis that would change everything began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday in early December. Charlotte had been looking forward to this particular day because James was scheduled for the morning shift, and she had something special to share with him. Her class had been studying Yorkshire in geography lessons, and she had learned that it was James's home county. She was excited to tell him about the things she had discovered about his homeland. However, when Charlotte arrived at the garden that morning, a different guard was standing at James's usual post. This guard was older, more rigid in his posture, and when Charlotte tried their usual wave, he didn't respond at all. She waited for nearly an hour, hoping that James might appear for a shift change, but he never came. Charlotte's concern grew throughout the day. James had never missed their morning encounters without some kind of explanation or signal. She found herself distracted during lessons, constantly looking toward the windows that faced the garden area. Her governess noticed her inattention, but attributed it to pre-Christmas excitement. That evening, Charlotte overheard a conversation between her parents that made her anxiety spike even higher. Prince William was discussing a personnel matter with Catherine, mentioning something about inappropriate conduct and necessary transfers. While they didn't mention names, Charlotte's instincts told her that this conversation was somehow connected to James's absence. The next morning, a different guard was again stationed at the garden post. Charlotte's fear and frustration finally overcame her usual caution. She approached this new guard and asked as politely as she could manage, "Where is Sergeant Morrison?" The guard, clearly uncomfortable with the direct question from a member of the royal family, simply replied, "I'm sorry, Your Highness, but I don't have information about staff assignments." Charlotte's heart sank. The formal way the guard addressed her, the complete lack of warmth in his response, reminded her of how isolated she had felt before her friendship with James began. She realized that she had become dependent on those daily moments of connection, and without them the world felt cold and unwelcoming again. Meanwhile, James was experiencing his own crisis 20 miles away at a military facility outside London. He had been abruptly reassigned 3 days earlier, with no explanation beyond a terse statement that his services were needed elsewhere. His new assignment involved training new recruits in basic security protocols, work that was important but felt like a punishment compared to his royal protection. Duties. James understood that his relationship with Charlotte had somehow been discovered. While no one had accused him of wrongdoing directly, the sudden transfer and the pointed comments from his superiors about maintaining appropriate professional boundaries made it clear that his interactions with the princess had been noticed and deemed inappropriate. The irony was painful. James had never felt more professional than during his time protecting Charlotte. His awareness of her emotional needs had made him more vigilant, more attuned to potential threats. more committed to his duties. Yet the very thing that had made him a better guard, his genuine care for the person he was protecting, was being treated as a liability. Back at Kensington Palace, Charlotte's behavior was beginning to concern the adults around her. She had stopped going to the garden altogether, preferring to spend her free time in her room. Her appetite decreased and she seemed to have lost interest in activities she had previously enjoyed. Her piano teacher reported that Charlotte appeared distracted and sad during lessons. Miss Williams, her governess, was the first to directly address the change in Charlotte's demeanor. During a quiet moment after afternoon lessons, she sat down with Charlotte and gently asked if something was troubling her. Charlotte looked at the woman who had been a constant presence in her life for the past 2 years. Miss Williams was kind and caring, but she was also employed by the palace, which meant that anything Charlotte said would eventually reach her parents and their staff. Charlotte desperately wanted to confide in someone, but she couldn't risk getting James into more trouble than he might already be in. "I'm just tired," Charlotte said, which was partially true. The emotional strain of losing her friend and not understanding why was exhausting. Miss Williams wasn't convinced, but she didn't push further. Instead, she made a mental note to mention Charlotte's mood to the princess's parents during their next weekly meeting. That weekend, Prince William and Catherine sat down with Charlotte for one of their regular family conversations. These talks were designed to maintain close communication between parents and children, despite the busy schedules that royal duties often required. "Miss Williams tells us, you've seemed a bit sad lately," Catherine said gently. "Is there anything you'd like to talk about?" Charlotte looked at her parents, two people who loved her deeply but who also represented the system that had taken James away from her. She wanted to tell them about her friendship, about how much those daily conversations had meant to her, about how lonely she felt without them. But she also understood, with the intuition that children often possess, that her parents would see her attachment to a guard as inappropriate rather than meaningful. "I miss having friends," Charlotte said finally. Which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. Her parents exchanged a glance. They had always been aware that Charlotte's royal status made normal friendships challenging, and they had worked hard to provide her with opportunities to interact with children her own age. However, they also recognized that these interactions were often artificial, constrained by protocol and the awareness of who Charlotte was. "Would you like to invite some of your classmates over for a playdate?" William suggested. Charlotte nodded, even though she knew that wouldn't solve the real problem. Her classmates were kind to her, but their relationships were always colored by her royal status. What she had lost with James was something different, a friendship based on genuine mutual understanding rather than social obligation. Over the following days, Charlotte found herself paying attention to the palace guards in a way she never had before. She began to realize that these men and women were individuals with their own lives, families, and feelings, rather than just uniformed figures who blended into the background of her daily existence. She noticed that some guards looked tired after long shifts, that others seemed worried about things beyond their professional duties, that a few appeared lonely despite being surrounded by colleagues. For the first time, Charlotte began to understand that the people who worked around her were human beings with their own struggles and joys. This realization made her miss James even more. He had been the first person in her protected world to see her as Charlotte, rather than Princess Charlotte. And in return, she had begun to see him as James, rather than just another guard. The loss of that mutual recognition left a void that no amount of formal playdates or official engagements could fill. As Christmas approached, Charlotte found herself hoping that the holiday season might somehow bring James back. Royal families often made staff changes during the holidays, and she allowed herself to believe that his transfer might only be temporary. However, the adults around her were moving in a different direction. Colonel Thompson had completed his investigation into the irregularities he had observed in the garden area, and his recommendations would soon be implemented in ways that would make any future friendship between Charlotte and a palace guard virtually impossible. The stage was being set for a confrontation between Charlotte's emotional needs and the institutional requirements of royal life. The question that remained was whether an 8-year-old girl's determination to maintain a friendship would be strong enough to challenge a system that had operated successfully for centuries. Christmas morning at Kensington Palace brought its usual mixture of joy and formality. Charlotte dutifully participated in the gift-opening ceremony, smiled for the official photographs, and played with her new toys while her parents handled various royal obligations. But throughout the festivities, she couldn't stop thinking about James and wondering if he was spending Christmas with his family in Yorkshire. The breakthrough came 2 days after Christmas when Charlotte overheard a phone conversation that changed everything. She had been walking past her father's study when she heard Prince William speaking with someone about the Morrison situation. The door was slightly ajar, and Charlotte found herself frozen in place as she listened to her father's side of the conversation. "I understand the protocol concerns," William was saying, "but from what I can see, Charlotte has been happier these past few months than I've seen her in a long time. If one of our guards has somehow contributed to that, perhaps we should be asking why rather than simply removing him." Charlotte's heart began racing. Her father was talking about James, and it sounded like he might actually understand that their friendship had been positive rather than problematic. She pressed closer to the door, desperate to hear more. "I'm not suggesting we ignore security protocols," William continued, "but I am suggesting that we consider the human element here. My daughter is 8 years old, and she's struggling with the isolation that comes with her position. If she's found some small comfort in an appropriate friendship with one of our guards, perhaps that's not entirely negative." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with William clearly arguing for a more nuanced approach to the situation. Charlotte couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but her father's responses suggested that he was meeting with resistance from whoever he was speaking with. When the call ended, Charlotte quickly moved away from the study door, her mind racing with possibilities. Her father seemed to understand that her friendship with James had been important to her, and he appeared to be fighting for some kind of resolution that wouldn't simply punish James for caring about her well-being. That evening, Charlotte made a decision that would require more courage than anything she had ever done before. She decided to talk to her parents directly about James and their friendship. The risk was enormous. Her confession could lead to more serious consequences for James, or it could help her parents understand what had really been happening in the garden those mornings. She found her parents in the sitting room after dinner, enjoying a rare, quiet moment together. Catherine was reading while William reviewed some official documents. The scene was peaceful and informal, which gave Charlotte hope that they might be receptive to what she had to say. "Mommy, Daddy," she began, her voice trembling slightly with nervousness, "I need to tell you something important." Both parents immediately gave her their full attention. They had learned to recognize when Charlotte was dealing with something serious, and her tone indicated that this was one of those moments. "It's about Sergeant Morrison," Charlotte continued, forcing herself to maintain eye contact with her parents. "He's my friend, and I think he got in trouble because of me." The silence that followed her statement seemed to last forever. William and Catherine exchanged a quick glance before William spoke. "Can you tell us about this friendship, sweetheart?" Charlotte took a deep breath and began to explain everything. She told them about that first wave in the garden, about the gradual development of their secret communication system, about the comfort she had found in having someone who saw her as just Charlotte, rather than Princess Charlotte. She was careful to emphasize that James had always been respectful and appropriate, and that their conversations had made her feel safer rather than putting her at risk. As she spoke, Charlotte watched her parents' faces carefully. She saw surprise, concern, and what she hoped was understanding. When she finished her explanation, the room fell quiet again as William and Catherine processed what they had heard. "Charlotte," Catherine said gently, "why didn't you tell us about this friendship sooner?" "Because I knew you would make it stop," Charlotte replied with the brutal honesty that only children possess. "And it was the only thing that made me feel less lonely." This statement hit both parents hard. They had worked so hard to give Charlotte as normal a childhood as possible, but her words made it clear that they hadn't fully understood the emotional cost of her royal status. William leaned forward in his chair. "Sweetheart, it's not that we don't want you to have friends, but there are rules about how members of our family interact with palace staff, and these rules exist for very important reasons." "But James never made me feel unsafe," Charlotte protested. "He made me feel more safe. And he never asked me to do anything wrong or told me secrets or anything like that. He just cared about me." Catherine felt tears forming in her eyes as she listened to her daughter's defense of her friend. The pain in Charlotte's voice was unmistakable, and it was clear that losing this friendship had affected her deeply. "What would you like us to do?" William asked, surprising both Charlotte and Catherine with the question. Charlotte hadn't expected to be asked for her opinion on a solution. In her experience, adults made decisions about her life without consulting her preferences. The fact that her father was asking what she wanted gave her hope that they might actually listen to her ideas. "Could James come back?" she asked quietly. "Not just as a guard, but as someone who's allowed to be my friend? I promise I wouldn't bother him when he's working, and I wouldn't tell anyone else about our friendship if that would help." William and Catherine looked at each other again, this time with expressions that Charlotte couldn't fully read. She sensed that they were having one of those silent conversations that married couples could have with just their eyes. "Let us think about this," Catherine said finally. "What you're asking for is complicated. But we understand how important this friendship is to you, and we want to find a way to help." Charlotte felt a surge of hope mixed with relief. Her parents hadn't dismissed her request immediately, which meant there might be a chance that something could be worked out. "In the meantime," William added, "I want you to know that you're not in trouble for having this friendship. Neither is Sergeant Morrison. What happened between you two doesn't sound inappropriate. It sounds like two people who cared about each other and found comfort in that caring." That night, after Charlotte had gone to bed, William and Catherine had a long conversation about their daughter's revelation. They realized that their attempts to protect Charlotte from the negative aspects of royal life had inadvertently isolated her from positive human connections as, "Well, she's right about one thing," Catherine said. "The rules that govern our interactions with staff were written for adults, not for children. Maybe we need to reconsider how those rules apply to Charlotte's situation." William nodded. "I keep thinking about what she said, that it was the only thing that made her feel less lonely. How did we miss the fact that our daughter was lonely?" The next morning, William made a phone call that would begin the process of bringing James back to Kensington Palace. However, the solution he had in mind would require changes to long-standing protocols and would need approval from multiple levels of palace administration. The question was whether the institutional machinery of royal life could be flexible enough to accommodate the genuine friendship between a lonely princess and a compassionate guard. The process of bringing James back to Kensington Palace proved to be more complex than William had initially anticipated. His phone call to Colonel Thompson the morning after Charlotte's confession had resulted in a tense conversation about precedent, protocol, and the potential risks of making exceptions to established security procedures. "Your Royal Highness," Colonel Thompson had said, his voice carefully controlled, "I understand your desire to ensure Princess Charlotte's happiness, but we cannot simply ignore the fact that Sergeant Morrison violated protocol by engaging in personal conversations with a member of the royal family." William had expected this resistance, but Charlotte's words about loneliness had fundamentally changed his perspective on the situation. "Colonel, what if we're looking at this backwards? What if the violation wasn't in having the conversation, but in our failure to recognize that my daughter needed that kind of connection?" The debate that followed involved multiple departments within the palace administration. The private secretary's office raised concerns about public perception if news of the friendship ever became public. The security team worried about creating precedents that could compromise future protection protocols. The household staff expressed concerns about maintaining appropriate boundaries between family members and employees. Meanwhile, James was dealing with his own uncertainty at the training facility. He had heard nothing official about his transfer, and his request for information about his status had been met with vague responses about ongoing administrative reviews. The not knowing was almost worse than any punishment would have been. His commanding officer at the training facility, Major Harrison, had noticed James's distraction during the past week. Harrison was a perceptive man who had served in various royal protection roles throughout his career, and he had heard rumors about the circumstances surrounding James's transfer. On New Year's Eve, Harrison called James into his office for what he described as an informal conversation. "Morrison," Harrison began, "I've received some interesting phone calls about you recently. It seems there's quite a debate going on about your future assignment." James felt his stomach tighten. "Sir, I want you to know that I never did anything inappropriate." I would never compromise the safety or security of any member of the royal family. Harrison studied James's face carefully. I believe you, Sergeant. From what I understand, the issue isn't what you did, but rather what the implications might be if other guards begin forming personal attachments to their charges. With respect, sir, James replied. Princess Charlotte isn't just a charge. She's a child who was struggling with isolation, and I happen to be in a position to provide some small comfort. I don't see how that compromises anyone's security. Harrison nodded slowly. That's exactly what Prince William said when he called me yesterday. James's eyes widened in surprise. He hadn't expected the prince to be personally involved in his situation, much less to be advocating for him. It seems, Harrison continued, that Princess Charlotte has been quite vocal about your friendship and its importance to her well-being. Her parents are now trying to find a way to accommodate this relationship within existing security frameworks. The relief James felt was overwhelming, but he tried to maintain his professional composure. What does that mean for my assignment, sir? It means you're going back to Kensington Palace, but under very different circumstances than before. They're creating a new position, something like a personal protection officer with expanded interpersonal responsibilities. You'll still be a guard, but you'll also be officially authorized to provide companionship and emotional support to Princess Charlotte. James couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. They're actually going to allow our friendship? More than allow it, they're going to formalize it. There will be guidelines and boundaries, of course, but the basic premise is that Princess Charlotte needs a friend, and you've proven yourself capable of being that friend while maintaining appropriate professional standards. Back at Kensington Palace, Charlotte was struggling with her own uncertainty. Her parents had told her they were working on a solution, but they hadn't provided any specifics or timeline. The not knowing was making her anxious, and hope and disappointment seemed to alternate in her mind every few hours. Her behavior during this waiting period revealed just how much the friendship with James had meant to her. She had become more withdrawn than ever, showing little interest in her usual activities. Her piano teacher reported that Charlotte seemed to be going through the motions of her lessons without any real engagement. Even her favorite books couldn't hold her attention for more than a few minutes at a time. Miss Williams, her governess, was growing increasingly concerned. She had never seen Charlotte so affected by any single event or change in her routine. The depth of the child's reaction to losing her friend had surprised all the adults around her and forced them to reconsider their understanding of Charlotte's emotional needs. The breakthrough came on January 3rd, when William received final approval for the new position they had created for James. The decision had required sign-offs from multiple levels of palace administration, but William's persistence and Charlotte's obvious distress had eventually won the day. That evening, William and Catherine sat down with Charlotte to explain what they had arranged. We have some news about Sergeant Morrison, William began, and Charlotte immediately perked up with attention. James is going to return to Kensington Palace, Catherine continued, but his job is going to be a little different than before. Charlotte's face lit up with hope, but she remained quiet, waiting to hear the details. He's going to be what we're calling your personal protection and companionship officer, William explained. That means his job will include keeping you safe, but it will also include being your friend. Charlotte's eyes widened. You mean I won't have to hide our friendship anymore? That's right, Catherine said. You'll be able to talk with James openly, and he'll be able to spend time with you without worrying about breaking any rules. The joy on Charlotte's face was unmistakable, but she was also smart enough to understand that this arrangement came with responsibilities. Will there be rules about our friendship? She asked. William nodded. There will be some guidelines about when and where you can spend time together, and James will still have his professional duties to attend to. But yes, within those boundaries, you'll be free to be friends. Charlotte was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then she asked the question that revealed how much she had been thinking about James's well-being. Is James happy about this arrangement? I don't want him to get in trouble because of me. Catherine felt her heart squeeze at her daughter's concern for her friend. James is very happy about it, sweetheart. He missed your friendship just as much as you missed his. That night, Charlotte slept better than she had in weeks. The knowledge that James would be returning, and that their friendship would be officially recognized rather than hidden, filled her with a happiness that had been missing from her life since his transfer. However, the arrangement that had been worked out was unprecedented in royal history, and its success would depend entirely on how well both Charlotte and James could navigate their new roles. They would be breaking new ground in the relationship between royal family members and palace staff, and the eyes of the entire household would be watching to see if this experiment in institutionalized friendship could actually work. The stage was now set for James's return and the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives, one where friendship and duty could coexist rather than conflict with each other. James's return to Kensington Palace on January 8th was unlike any homecoming he had ever experienced. As he walked through the familiar corridors toward Colonel Thompson's office for his briefing, he was acutely aware that everything had changed. He was no longer just Sergeant Morrison, Royal Guard. He was about to become something entirely new in the history of royal household staff. Colonel Thompson's demeanor during the briefing was professional, but noticeably warmer than it had been during James's last days at the palace. The older man had initially opposed the new arrangement, but Prince William's determination and Charlotte's obvious need had eventually convinced him to support the experiment. Your new position comes with unique responsibilities and unprecedented freedoms, Thompson explained as he handed James a folder containing his revised job description. You will continue to provide security services, but you will also be expected to serve as a companion and mentor to Princess Charlotte. James reviewed the documents carefully. His official title was Personal Protection and Companionship Officer, and his duties included everything from standard security protocols to providing emotional support and friendship to Princess Charlotte within appropriate boundaries. The guidelines are necessarily broad, Thompson continued, because we're creating something that has never existed before. Your success in this role will depend largely on your judgment and your ability to balance friendship with professionalism. The most significant change was that James would now have scheduled time with Charlotte that was separate from his security duties. He would spend 2 hours each morning in what the documents called companionship periods, during which his primary responsibility would be simply being Charlotte's friend. There will be observers initially, Thompson warned, not to interfere, but to ensure that the arrangement is working as intended. If this experiment succeeds, it could change how we approach the emotional well-being of royal children in the future. James understood the weight of responsibility he was carrying. This arrangement wasn't just about his friendship with Charlotte. It was about whether the rigid structures of royal life could be flexible enough to accommodate basic human needs. Meanwhile, Charlotte was barely containing her excitement. She had awakened that morning knowing that James would be returning, and she had spent the early hours imagining what their first official conversation would be like. The freedom to speak openly with him, without fear of breaking rules or getting either of them in trouble, felt almost too good to be true. Miss Williams, her governess, had noticed Charlotte's improved mood immediately. For the first time in weeks, Charlotte had eaten a full breakfast and had shown enthusiasm during her morning lessons. The child who had been withdrawn and listless was suddenly animated and engaged again. At precisely 10 o'clock, there was a soft knock on the door of the small sitting room where Charlotte was having her mid-morning break. Miss Williams opened the door to reveal James, looking slightly nervous but smiling. "Your Highness," he said formally, "I'm here for our scheduled time together." Charlotte jumped up from her chair, her face beaming with joy. "James, you're really back." For a moment, both of them felt the awkwardness of their new situation. They had spent months communicating in whispers and secret gestures, and now they were suddenly free to interact normally. It felt almost surreal. "I am really back," James confirmed, his own smile growing wider. "And I'm told that we're allowed to be proper friends now." Charlotte nodded enthusiastically. "Mummy and Daddy explained everything. You're my personal protection and companionship officer now. That means you're both my bodyguard and my friend." "That's right," James said, "though I have to admit I'm not entirely sure how to be an official friend. I've never had that job title before." Charlotte giggled at this admission. "I don't think anyone has ever had that job title before. We're probably making it up as we go along." Their first official conversation took place in the garden where their friendship had begun. As they walked along the same paths where they had once communicated only through waves and gestures, both of them marveled at how different everything felt. "I missed this," Charlotte said as they sat down on her familiar bench. "Not just talking to you, but having someone who knows me as just Charlotte." James nodded. "I missed it too." But I have to ask, are you comfortable with other people knowing about our friendship now? I know you preferred to keep it private before. Charlotte considered this question seriously. I think I like it better this way. Keeping it secret made it feel like we were doing something wrong, even though we weren't. Now it feels honest. Over the following weeks, their new arrangement settled into a comfortable routine. James would spend his morning companionship periods with Charlotte, during which they would walk in the garden, talk about books, or simply enjoy each other's company. In the afternoons, he would resume his standard security duties, maintaining professional distance while remaining aware of Charlotte's emotional state. The observers who had been assigned to evaluate the arrangement reported consistently positive findings. Charlotte's academic performance improved dramatically, her social interactions became more confident, and her overall demeanor was noticeably happier and more secure. More importantly, James proved adept at balancing his dual roles. During companionship periods, he was warm and engaging, sharing stories from his childhood and listening patiently to Charlotte's concerns about school, family, and growing up royal. During security duties, he was professional and alert, never allowing his personal affection for Charlotte to compromise his vigilance. Other members of the palace staff initially watched the arrangement with skepticism, but even the most doubtful gradually came to see its value. Charlotte's improved happiness affected everyone around her. She was more cooperative with her governess, more engaged with her tutors, and more pleasant during family time. Perhaps most significantly, the arrangement began to change how other palace employees thought about their relationships with the royal family. James's success in combining friendship with professionalism demonstrated that caring about the people you serve could enhance rather than compromise your professional effectiveness. Prince William and Catherine watched these developments with growing satisfaction. They had taken a significant risk in challenging long-standing protocols, but the results vindicated their decision. Their daughter was thriving in ways she never had before, and her happiness radiated throughout the entire household. 6 months after James's return, Charlotte was asked by her school counselor to write an essay about friendship. Her response, which she shared with her parents, captured the essence of what she had learned from her relationship with James. A real friend is someone who sees who you really are, not who everyone else thinks you should be. A real friend makes you feel safe to be yourself even when yourself isn't perfect. I have learned that friendship isn't about having the same job or living in the same kind of house. It's about caring about each other and wanting each other to be happy. The essay concluded with a line that brought tears to her parents' eyes. I used to think that being a princess meant I couldn't have normal friendships. Now I know that being a princess means I can help change the rules so that friendship is always possible. James's position as personal protection and companionship officer became permanent, and his success led to the creation of similar roles for other royal children. The experiment that had begun with a simple wave in a palace garden had grown into a new understanding of how duty and humanity could coexist. Years later, as Charlotte grew into adolescence and then adulthood, her friendship with James remained a constant source of strength and stability in her life. He was there for her first heartbreak, her graduation, her official royal duties, and all the small moments in between that make up a life. Their story became legendary within palace circles, proof that sometimes the most important rules are the ones that need to be broken, and that the strongest protocols are the ones that make room for human connection. The secret gesture that had started it all, Charlotte's tentative wave to a lonely guard, had grown into something much larger. A demonstration that even within the most formal institutions, friendship and compassion could find a way to flourish. In the end, Charlotte and James had accomplished something remarkable. They had shown that it was possible to honor both duty and friendship, to serve both institution and individual, and to create new traditions that honored the best of both old and new ways of thinking about what it means to protect and care for another person.